What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video. And we looked at Dimir midrange last week. Again, I think it's the best midrange deck currently for the format, but even though it's not the most popular deck in terms of metagame share, I think Golgari midrange is kind of the one that people default to. It was one of the best performing midrange decks that we kind of see currently from the World Championship, and I think for a while it's just been the default color combination for midrange as far back as like the mid 90s of Magic. So I think it's just kind of this primal thought of just like Golgari is usually the best mid-range colors, and quite frankly it's very easy to see why this deck is very popular and why it is still very good, and it's the second most played deck currently in the standard metagame. But before we get too deep, of course, into Golgari midrange and talk about what makes the deck so powerful and why players continue to play it even if there is another more played midrange deck in the format, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me where we post mainly about the modern, pioneer, and standard formats, as well as some other longer form content. So if any of that interests you, please consider subscribing and ring that notification bell so you know when videos get posted. It's a free, easy way to support me and my content, and if you'd like to go and supporting me any further, you can go in the description down below. You can subscribe to the Casual Spikes podcast, where me and my co-host Randy over at Modern with Randy talk about whatever the current RCQ format is, and just talk about news, things in general for Magic and our own, of course, lovable, charming ways. So if that interests you, go ahead, subscribe there, join the Discord server and down below. And if you are interested in playing any decks like this that we see on the channel, you can go ahead and use my code down below to sign up for Manatraders, which will allow you to get a monthly service where you can rent basically whatever cards you want and play whatever formats to play in different challenges and different Moto leagues online. On top of that too, they have their own free tournament series that they run that you can be a part of and get full prizes for that. So I really love Manatraders. I've had them for a really long time, and I'm sure you will. With all that said, let's go ahead and talk about Golgari midrange, as again, this is not necessarily the premier midrange deck, but this is like the midrange deck, the rock as people call it, as you might hear. So this version of Golgari midrange is a little bit different from what we've seen from past iterations, and it's focusing pretty heavily on the card Llanowar Elves. Now, usually when you see decks playing Llanowar Elves, it's either because they're trying to go from 1 to 3, and they're basically kind of all in on this going from 1 to 3, and that can be very powerful when you're playing a 3-drop on turn 2, especially when you're on the draw. It's a way that you can catch up. When you're on the play, it's a way to get super far ahead. But this uses it kind of differently because it doesn't necessarily need that jump. Now, obviously, playing Llanowar Elf kind of gets you to cards like Glissa Sunslayer, Preacher of the Schism a lot earlier. Of course, it still does help you get to Archfiend and Shieldred a turn sooner. Playing them on turn 3 is also very powerful, but obviously that main jump, like where your opponent is going to end up actually getting rid of your Llanowar Elf, is going to be on like their turn 1 or turn 2, depending on what when I guess you're taking a turn, if you're going first or second. So like we're really focused on these 3s here with, again, Glissa, Preacher of the Schism. We can even like combine this sort of advantage into, say, like playing like a cut down on our opponent's turn 1 play into something like a Scavenging Ooze, or drawing a card with Mosswood Dread Knight, something like that. Even playing like a 2-mana removal spell into maybe another Llanowar Elf to kind of keep that mana advantage going. We can even play Unholy Annex, which is going to be a really good card, and I hate the fact that they choose this art for it. It's so hard to read, but Unholy Annex is a room card that shares a side with Ritual Chamber. So for 2 and a black, at the beginning of your end step, you draw a card, and if you control a demon, each opponent loses 2 life. You gain 2 life, otherwise you just lose 2 life. So it's a little bit worse for Phyrexian Arena, but it does have some upside because you can then just pay 5 mana to get a 6/6 demon, which is very big and ends up closing out a game very quickly. So you can kind of get some extra card advantage, and that's kind of where, again, we talked about with Dimir midrange, where it does have this option of being able to kind of get ahead on cards, where it's able to kind of crush your opponent and push its advantage by having so many cards. And even though its creatures are small, eventually they're going to win the game when you're able to basically take out whatever creatures could potentially get in front of your creatures, and then also just be able to, again, race them because you're going through and getting so much card advantage. This a lot less card advantage, but you do have Unholy Annex that can give you card advantage and also be a way that you can sort of kind of win the game. And kind of circling back here to, Archfiend of the Dross at 4, being a 6/6 flyer for 4, is very aggressive, flying, so it is evasive. Comes into play with 4 oil counters on it, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you remove an oil counter from it, and then if it has no oil counters on it, you lose the game. So it's not that it goes to 0, or you go to remove 1 and there's none to remove. Just if it has only 1 on it, chances are you are going to lose the game. You have to figure out how to get it off the board or kill your opponent. But thankfully, whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, that its controller loses 2 life. So you are able to kind of stack the removal spells in the deck with Archfiend of the Dross to, again, remove your opponent's creatures. They lose life. You attack them, you hit them for a bunch, and then eventually, you know, their life total is going to run pretty low. And especially if they're playing their own copies of Unholy Annex, you can kind of get them in that way as long as they don't have demons on the board, or you kind of keep their demons off the board. You know, their Annex is going to help you kind of chip in that little bit of extra damage to where your Archfiend and your Shieldred can just kind of close out those kinds of games. Even Shieldred being very good because them drawing a card with Unholy Annex is something that just happens. So they're going to end up, and it doesn't go into their hand. They do actually draw it. So this is a way that they'll lose 2 life from drawing that card. And if they don't have any demons, then they will also just lose 2 life, another 2 life. So potentially losing 4 damage there with the Shieldred. So I think Shieldred ends up being pretty good in this format. Now, obviously, the creatures are awesome. You know, we know that Glissa is absolutely amazing. You know, 3 mana, 3/3, first strike, death touch. You're never attacking past this card on the ground. And then eventually, when you can start turning it sideways, you can end up getting a little bit of extra card advantage going by drawing a card, losing a life, destroying an enchantment. We know that Unholy Annex is a very good card to kind of target. There's also the secret mode of remove up to 3 counters from target permanent. So this does work on the Archfiend of the Dross, where you can actually remove the counters off of it. If your opponent just decides that they're not going to block the Glissa, and they're like, well, I'll just, you know, save a turn for whatever. I have seen it happen a few times. Some players do make the mistake or just don't realize that that's a mode on Glissa. So that is something to be aware if you're playing against Glissa. And if you're playing with it, you know, and you see an Archfiend of the Dross on the other side of the table, more than likely if your opponent doesn't block Glissa with that Archfiend, they could potentially be in trouble. Depending on kind of what happens, you can get them into those situations pretty easily. But the other spells that you have to kind of control the board here, we have Cut Down, Go from the Throat as the main kind of removal spells that we're looking at. Typically, you would see cards like Anoint with Affliction in the main deck. This version in particular decides to put Anoint in the sideboard, along with another Cut Down, by the way, to go with Maelstrom Pulse to destroy target non-land permanent and all permanents that share the same name as that permanent. It seems like a lot of times when people play Golgari, they always draw Unholy Annexes in multiples. So this is like a way that you could destroy an Unholy Annex and get rid of the rest of them. I believe in this specific case with like Maelstrom Pulse and Rooms, if your opponent has like Unholy Annex unlocked on one and then Ritual Chamber unlocked on the other, if you target either one of them, it doesn't destroy the other one. But if, you know, you would target an Unholy Annex and your opponent has another one with both rooms unlocked, if you destroy the one with both rooms unlocked, I believe it'll destroy any of them that have either side unlocked. So while it does sound pretty complicated, it also does sound pretty correct to me. But anyway, so we have Maelstrom Pulse and Virtue of Persistence as the other forms of removal that this deck has. Virtue being a sorcery, you give a creature -3/-3 until in turn, you gain 2 life. This is a slight upgrade from, you know, something like an Anoint in a way. So Anoint exiles a creature, so you don't get like the death trigger from the Heartfire heroes, and this kind of in some ways will end up doing the same thing. It's going to shrink its power and toughness, meaning that if it's just a 3/3, it's not going to be able to deal any damage because its power is 0 when it dies, and then you're also going to gain 2 life there. So it's a little helpful in that sense. -3/-3 also does deal with things like Glissa Sunslayer. I mean, again, does kind of deal with things with Anoint with Affliction, and actually Anoint would actually be a little bit better against Preacher of the Schism. But, you know, the Virtue of Persistence, just the card itself, is also very good. By getting a creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control, no finality counters to worry about. You're just going to be able to get that creature back and kind of continue to put pressure on your opponent. You're kind of okay with, again, trading a bunch of resources and stuff when you're looking towards potentially playing a Virtue of Persistence on your opponent and being able to take, you know, the creatures out of their graveyard if necessary. And of course, you're also rocking like Preacher, Sunslayer, you know, Archfiends, Shieldreds, things like that. So it's going to end up being pretty good for you. Royal Treatment is a really interesting card. So it's essentially a protection spell. You know, your creature gains hexproof until end of turn, and then you create a royal roll token attached to that creature where it gets +1/+1 and has ward 1. Ward is very annoying to deal with, and the buff can be pretty useful itself here. This does kind of help us with, you know, playing Llanowar Elf on turn 1, where then we can play things like Scavenging Ooze, Mosswood, Dread Knight, whatever the case may be. You know, from that point on, we can kind of kind of play on curve. Like, we can get to a point where we can play Glissa on turn 3, no big deal, have a green mana left open. We can end up protecting Glissa, because again, Glissa is a very good creature here. Awesome on defense, even better on really good on offense, even better on defense, because like no ground creatures are ever getting through this card. And it's very annoying when this early in the game you're kind of put into the abyss, because you then risk your opponent drawing, potentially 2-3 extra cards and whatnot, and kind of going further up on the chain here with thanks to like Land of War Elf and whatever. But yeah, like this is kind of the main build it seems like that these Golgari decks are kind of going towards. We had seen Anoint with Affliction, of course. Now we're kind of seeing some protection spells, plus maybe a little bit more mass removal in like Maelstrom Pulse, Virtue of Persistence being able to gain a little bit of life, with the aggro deck still being fairly popular in the format. No Caustic Bronco here. I know it was kind of like a dream for players to flip an Unholy Annex, or some of them even playing Virtue of Persistence, because then you could just 7 or 8 your opponent's life total with a Caustic Bronco on turn 2, because you had so many 3 power creatures that you could play on turn 3. Either with like the help of Land of War Elf playing like Archfiend of Dross, or just naturally playing your third land, playing Glissa Sunslayer, and kind of doing all those things. I would imagine Caustic Bronco is a little bit worse nowadays, and you probably just want to be a little bit heavier on removal, and Royal Treatment's kind of a nice option here to protect your creatures, and then also kind of give them I guess extra protection onwards, and just kind of make it awkward for your opponent to be able to double spell on like turn 4 and turn 5, which can be very helpful, where your opponent's kind of forced to spend all of their mana or most of their mana on like dealing with a creature that they've already spent another spell on. So you kind of like 2-for-1 them in that way, or I guess really like in a weird way 2-for-2 them. But when they don't have those removal spells, and you're just hitting them with again, Preachers, Glissas, Archfiends, Shieldreds, it does make life pretty rough for players. Finally, looking at the sideboard here, we've seen Cut Down, Anoint with Affliction, just more removal. Terror Sunder is pretty versatile, because you can bring it in to destroy artifacts or enchantments, and you actually exile them for that matter. And then if it's kicked, where you essentially pay a green, a black, and 2 generic, you can exile target non-land permanent instead. Again, fulfilling the clause of basically getting around any of the dies triggers in the format. Also getting something like the Glimmers creatures, where we have like the Enduring Curiosity, the things like that. You can just end up exiling them for 2 mana, and they are not going to come back to the battlefield. Trinkle Frillback has been kind of the go-to option. Sometimes this shows up in the main board, and probably even more defensible having it in the main board, thanks to playing Land of War Elves. But you don't necessarily want to play this on turn 2 as your 3-drop. You definitely want to play this when you have a few more lands in play to get some of the relevant modes, so you can pay that extra green to potentially get an artifact or enchantment off the board, exile a player's graveyard, or even gain 4 life. Again, this being very good against the aggro decks, because it is big enough usually to block any of their creatures. They're going to have to muscle their way through your creatures with this Tranquil Frillback and play, while also gaining life is really nice. Cases command for the other creature decks. Nissa Ascended Animist is definitely a good closer. You are playing a decent amount of forest in this deck with a whopping 6 forests, so... And actually, surprisingly, this not playing any of the Surveil land, which is kind of neat, leaning more towards on like Restless Cottage and Land of War Waste and Blooming Marsh and things like that. But, this can make some very big creatures where, X is its, make an XX Phyrexian Horror, where X is Nissa Ascended Animist's loyalty, so you can potentially have an 8/8 creature that you're putting onto the board, or you can just, again, creature you control get +1/+1 for each force you control and gain trample, and just completely trample over your opponent. Or just kind of remove some artifacts and enchantments on the board with Nissa. Play for 5, play for 7. It's going to be pretty good either way. Scavenging Ooze, another card in the sideboard, and Forward Arrest here. And that is the Golgari midrange deck for standard, excuse me. I'm not used to saying that yet. Crazy. But yeah, as you can kind of see, like there is a lot of powerful things going on in this midrange deck. It does kind of close out games a lot faster than Dimir does. Dimir, you're kind of stuck spinning your tires, but really for like the price of that, you end up drawing potentially 3, 4, 5, 6 cards a turn, and you're not really having your life total really affected by drawing those cards, where a lot of the cards in here, if you're trying to keep up on the card advantage, Mosswood Dread Knight's going to cost you a life if you want to draw with it. Obviously these are cases like outside of Shieldred. Shieldred on the battlefield just benefits you for drawing extra cards, but Unholy Annex, you're going to lose 2 life if you don't have a demon. Mosswood Dread Knight, you're going to lose life and 2 draw a card. So it can be pretty rough. You definitely want Llanowar Elf starts in this deck, as you are not really leaning on Llanowar Elf too much, but you do kind of get the ball heavily rolling and just kind of snowball way farther than what your opponent's going to actually keep up with if you do start on Llanowar Elf and it is able to survive that first turn. And really, in a lot of cases, I don't think players really want to spend their cut downs on Llanowar Elves, so you're kind of like in this weird position of like, well, do I really want to use my removal spell on the elf, or do I want to use it for whatever could potentially be played? And if you're like staring at a cut down in your hand and your opponent goes Glissa, you're going to end up really regretting it. So just kind of depends on like the amount of reps and stuff you kind of take with this deck. But yeah, that's going to do it for me and this video. Hope y'all enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like on the video. Comment down below what standard decks you would like to see next. I'm just kind of moving through the queue of some of the more played and more popular decks of the format. So, you know, if you're interested in that, well, I guess, you know, still say something. I would really appreciate it. The algorithm absolutely loves it. Leave a like on the video and of course subscribe to the channel and continue showing your support. I really do appreciate any and all people that comment, subscribe, any of that stuff. So, but yeah, that's gonna do it for me. Hope y'all enjoyed the video and I hope to see you all in the next one.